What's up everyone, we are back with more New World, as today we are going to be really getting stuck in to the Spear Musket build as the ultimate crowd control class. As you all probably know, I started New World at launch with Musket and Rapier, a build which actually I still really love, just for its raw DPS. But more recently I have been absolutely loving the stun, the knockdown, and the just general crowd control that comes with the spear. And so in this video I wanted to share my spear build with you all. Both the spear and the musket though are going to be primarying off of dexterity, which makes them an obvious combination to use together. I'm also obviously going to be going for maximum damage here and running the class as a DPS, so I'm going to be putting roughly 75% about of my attribute points into dexterity and around 25% into constitution. Obviously dexterity I'll be stopping at roughly 300, so as you sort of get to the end game and your total attribute point starts to push 500, that percentage balance will change slightly, but at least running up to that, that's kind of the rough balance I'm running. The constitution is obviously to give the class at least a small amount of survivability, although I guess as almost a direct counter to that, I am going to be running the class with light armor, mostly for the mobility, the 20% increase in damage, and the dodge rolls are awesome with light armor, and that's really what sells the light armor to me. But on the flip side, it does make you pretty fragile, particularly in larger skirmishes and in the sort of 50v50 territory wars where you can get picked off and killed pretty quickly as a light armor user. But enough about the attributes. Let's start by getting stuck into the spear. As we said at the start, in my opinion, spear is all about crowd control. You want to be keeping your enemies either stunned or on the floor for as long as possible, which in the case of enemy players can prevent their escape and just flat out allow you to apply really good amounts of damage without really taking anything in return. The enemy can't hit you if they're on their back. And this is why I've focused on speccing my mastery points in spear towards these crowd control and debuff abilities. So we are over on the New World fans website, which is actually really awesome for its builder. I really like it, particularly now they've updated it to make it really clear which are the abilities you are selecting. All the abilities that I've gone for are focused towards applying some form of stun, knockdown or crowd control. So we have sweep, which is actually knocking your enemies to the floor. We have basically our base damage ability, but actually if you land all 3 hits you're going to be getting a stagger, plus it applies rend. And we've finally got vault kick, which is about getting stunned, but it's also a vault kick over distance. It allows you to essentially travel forward, so it's normally my opening ability. But let's go through these in a little bit more detail, because they actually have some fairly confusing terms associated with them. So once you level up sweep, you're going to be getting grit applied to the ability. Grit is one of these confusing New World terms that no one seems to quite understand what it does, but in essence is what grit does is it makes your ability uninterruptible. In a slightly more complicated sense, it means when you take damage using the ability, you take both health and stamina damage, and the only way to really interrupt a grit ability is to run the enemy player out of stamina, and then you will interrupt the ability. But it basically makes sweep uninterruptible for all essential purposes. And so that makes it a really nice ability. And it puts enemies on their back. It's not a stun, it's not a stagger, it's a knockdown. And it follows up with a very damaging sort of powerful downward stab, so that you knock them on the floor, and then so long as you press left click, pretty much at the very end of the sweep, and you have to be pretty quick or you'll miss it, your character will go into a downward stab. But this is giving me quite a bit of control. I like this for that. We then move on to perforate. So this is our main damaging ability. It's 3 stabs in very quick succession. It does only do 70% of your base weapon damage. So actually, it's not going to be putting in huge numbers right from the off, but it does apply rend. So rend effectively is a debuff to the enemy. It basically lowers the enemy's defenses and means they can take basically a higher amount of damage. It reduces their damage absorption. So in here, because you're stabbing them 3 times, you basically apply 3 stacks of rend. And then this increases to 10% per strike once you get the second level, assuming the target has above 50% health. You can see now we've basically applied 30% damage reduction. Then if we hop down to the passive down here, we get 10% more damage on per debuff on target. So actually you can see how this starts to now stack up. And you can see by applying the rend here, we're now starting to stack with some of our passives. So after you've used this ability, you should notice that your damage will go up significantly when you're applying then subsequent attacks. And then finally we have Vault Kick. So as I said at the start, this one does apply a stun, but it also allows you to sort of basically travel over a distance. You sort of pole vault off your spear and sort of kick forwards. Causes quite a lot of stun, which is very nice. It does have taunt gem compatibility, but at least for my build that's not something I really want. I'm a light armor spear user, I don't want to be aggroing all the monsters in the room. That's a job definitely for the tank. We do gain Empower, and Empower as the final confusing New World term basically increases the amount of damage that I do. We have Uninterruptible, a debuff to the enemy, and then basically a buff to us. So you can see what I'm saying when I said that the class is all about crowd control and sort of buffs and debuffs. They all start to stack together. There's a number of interesting passives like the increased damage. We get sort of a slow applied on the light attack chain. There's also a cooldown basically if you get the second hit on the light attack chain, which you should realistically be doing considering that the light attack chain with the spear is pretty fast. It's not rapier fast, but it's pretty fast. And then we have another number of interesting passives, increased damage when people are starting to run out of health, and a few other little bits as we go down, increased critical targets, etc, etc. So that's really my spear build. So it's really focusing on that crowd control and on that sort of active buff debuff status that the spear can have. So this then leads us on to the musket. I've covered parts of the musket before in a previous build, but since then I have changed a few things around and have been playing around a little bit with shooter's stance. The musket itself though is a weapon that I have been enjoying since alpha. I love how brutally accurate it is. I mean, this is of course down to it being a hit scan weapon rather than a projectile based weapon like the bow. It does of course have extremely long range and can hit targets right out of your maximum view distance, and it hits like an absolute bus, particularly when you spec it towards a maximum alpha damage like I have. Previously I've actually only specced my musket with two active skills, Powder Burn and Power Shot. All of my other mastery points were really specced into passives, because I'm trying to get my damage out early on, particularly in PvP. Once I've got my first few hits, then I'll be switching over to my spear. But I have since been testing out shooter's stance, and it can have its uses, certainly in some situations. So here we are on my current musket build. So kind of as we said before, my build is all focused towards the alpha damage. It's about getting those few hits in, but those few hits hitting as hard as possible. It also orientates fairly towards headshots as well. So that means that the build is very spec towards the passives in the build and much less so towards the active abilities. If you watch my rapier musket video, you'll see that the slight change has been actually to put a little bit into open up and unlock shooter's stance. Whereas before, I was actually just running two abilities, both Powder Burn and Power Shot. Because as I say, it's all about getting those initial hits in. So Powder Burn is the best musket ability. It does a nice 110% base weapon damage, and it applies that burn, which applies a 20% weapon damage stack for 9 seconds. If you can headshot it though, and once you've got it unlocked, then that's going to extend that burn to 13 seconds. It's going to be almost like 300% damage. It means that you can do an intense amount of damage, and over a 13-second period, that's really quite a long time. And while the target is burning, you're getting an additional 12% damage on top of that. And this is where the passives start to stack, and is kind of the point. You then get, for example, I don't really use the optical zoom, I'm not really that bothered about that, but the 15% increased damage to all headshots, that's nice. So now we've got a 15% headshot damage increase, plus a 12% base damage increase. Upon hitting a headshot, so if you hit a headshot with your first Powder Burn shot, you're then getting Empower. okay, which increases the musket's damage and power, basically a buff to you, to your damage. Then I think one of these is an aim down the sight. Aim down the sight, 5% increase. You can see my point, how these passives are basically stacking. If the target's below 30% health, 10% more damage. And now previously, I built the build entirely basically around this tactical reload, which has the essence of you could load a powder burn, because you can preload something like a powder burn and it will stay on the weapon basically forever. So you could fire your powder burn, and then all you need to do is dodge, and the musket will instant reload. So that means you could fire, dodge, and then fire again, which makes you can get 2 shots off in very quick succession. Okay, you may well miss the headshot. I often do. I'm not the greatest shot in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but actually the core damage is also still very, very high. And I think with practice you'll find, at least I've found, that my headshot rate is starting to increase, and that's important. So that's kind of where I built it around, this tactical reload. But also by introducing shooter stance, you do sometimes in certain situations get the opportunity to fire your powder burn, then drop and get your 3 shots off. It's basically just a flat damage, same 100% base weapon damage, but you get 3 shots at significantly reduced reload. You could, in theory, take off one of these abilities, one of the passives, and go for the 5 shots. But in my opinion, you're then kind of starting to move away from what this build is about. This build isn't about an extended musket fighting build. This is about getting your couple of shots off, getting your high alpha damage, getting that burn applied, then switching to your spear and getting stuck in. It's not about having a prolonged distanced engagement. I think there are better musket builds for that. This is about short, high damage, burst damage before moving into melee. And I think once you start to go too much down the shooter's stance, I think you're starting to lose that. And I think even on the base shooter stance, it encourages me to sometimes shoot a stance when I really shouldn't be, and sometimes waiting for the enemy to get too close. And if you leave it too long and they're basically on top of you, I don't get time to switch to my spear, I don't get my vault kick off, the enemy will land the first hit, and in which case you're then losing the initiative, and that's why I think you start to go a little bit wrong sometimes down the shooter's stance. You could take Trapper, similar effect, basically like deploying caltrops. It basically slows the enemy down and makes it harder for them to be able to get up to you. It's a nice way of protecting yourself. But again, for me, that's not really what the class is about. The class is about just that high alpha damage on that first sort of, 1 to 3 shots. So I think Shooter Stance is just as a 1 ability, I took off the initial engagement from Power Shot because I predominantly use Powder Burn. You could argue what is the use of Power Shot in this situation, but it is nice to sometimes have a high damage backup ability, particularly when you get stuck with Powder Burn on cooldown. That for me is what the musket is all about. So hopefully this helps give you some ideas for a spear musket build. You can of course use either the musket or the spear with other weapons such as the rapier, the bow, or even the hatchet, so feel free to make adjustments to fit your class and your own playstyle. Of course, if you have any further questions about any of this, please feel free to let me know in the comments down below and get back to you. And of course, subscribe to the channel for lots more New World content. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you all on the next one.